Millionaire should have died in the car crash, but the black woman who saved him changed everything. Some people are saved by angels. James was saved by a woman who had every reason to keep driving. The car was supposed to be his coffin, but her hands pulled him toward a life he'd never imagined deserving. James Whitmore stood at the floor-to-ceiling windows of his penthouse, watching the city wake up 30 floors below. The morning light caught the crystal tumbler in his hand, still half full of whiskey from the night before. Or maybe it was fresh. The days blended together when you had nothing but time and everything but purpose. His phone buzzed against the marble countertop. Another missed call from his assistant. The sound echoed in the silence, a hollow ping in a space designed for entertaining dozens but occupied by one. The imported Italian leather sofa had never been sat on. The grand piano in the corner had never been played. Even the art on the walls, worth more than most people's houses, felt like expensive camouflage for an empty life. He'd built an empire by the age of 35. Tech innovations that changed how people connected with each other, ironically making him more isolated than ever. Every handshake came with an agenda. Every smile had a price tag. Every conversation was a transaction. The whiskey burned his throat as he finished it. Another day to get through. Another series of meetings where people would tell him what they thought he wanted to hear. Another night alone in his fortress of success. His Armani suit hung perfectly pressed in the closet, waiting. The Italian leather shoes, polished to mirror brightness, stood ready. The mask he wore to face the world, charming, confident, untouchable, hung invisible but heavy on his shoulders. James set down the glass and reached for his car keys. The Porsche would cut through morning traffic like a blade. Fast, efficient, isolated, just like everything else in his life. 20 miles across the city, Grace Martinez was already 3 hours into her day. The diner's fluorescent lights hummed overhead as she refilled coffee cups and smiled at faces that had become familiar over the past 2 years. Mrs. Chen always ordered 2 eggs over easy with wheat toast. Miguel liked his coffee black with sugar on the side. The construction crew from the Morrison Building project took turns leaving quarters in the tip jar, their rough hands gentle when they handed her their mugs. "You're glowing this morning, Mija," Mrs. Chen said, patting Grace's hand as she set down the plate. "Something good happen?" Grace's smile was genuine, the kind that reached her eyes and transformed her entire face. "Just grateful for another day, Mrs. Chen. That's all." It wasn't completely true. Last night, she'd finally saved enough to enroll in the nursing program at the community college. The acceptance letter was tucked in her uniform pocket like a secret promise. 6 months of double shifts, skipped meals, and mended clothes had led to this moment. Her future felt possible again. The breakfast rush was winding down when her phone buzzed. A text from the medical temp agency. Emergency placement needed. Home care for post-accident patient. Pays double rate. Available today. Grace's heart jumped. Double rate meant she could quit her weekend job at the grocery store, maybe even afford the textbooks for her first semester. Her fingers hovered over the screen, then typed back. "Can you send details?" The response came quickly. "Wealthy client, recent car accident, needs assistance with daily activities. References required. Position could be ongoing. Wealthy client." Grace's stomach tightened. She'd learned to be careful around people with money. They had ways of making you feel small, of reminding you that your place was temporary and conditional. But double rate was double rate, and dreams required sacrifices. She typed back, "I'll take it." The diner door chimed, and a young mother entered with 2 small children clinging to her legs. Grace recognized the look, the careful counting of quarters, the way her eyes scanned the cheapest items on the menu. Without thinking, Grace grabbed a stack of pancakes from the warming plate and a carton of milk. "On the house," she said quietly, setting the food in front of the children. "They look hungry." The mother's eyes filled with tears. "I can't." "You can," Grace said firmly. "We all need help sometimes." She turned away before the woman could argue, her heart full despite her wallet being light. This was wealth too, she told herself. the ability to ease someone's burden, to choose kindness over self-preservation. It was a currency her ex-fiancé had never understood. Patrick had been all smooth words and expensive gifts, making her feel like a princess in his world of charity galas and wine tastings. Until she'd become inconvenient. Until her background, her family, her dreams had become embarrassments he needed to manage or eliminate. The breakup had been surgical, clean, efficient. He'd returned to his world of appropriate connections and beneficial relationships, leaving her to rebuild from nothing. But the nothing had taught her something valuable. She was enough, just as she was. Grace untied her apron and hung it on the hook by the kitchen. The lunch shift would start in an hour, but she had enough time to go home, change, and make it to the client's address. She kissed Mrs. Chen's cheek and squeezed Miguel's shoulder as she passed. "See you tomorrow," she called, pushing through the door into the crisp morning air. The city stretched before her, full of possibilities and pitfalls. Somewhere in the maze of streets and buildings, two lives were about to collide in ways neither could imagine. Fate was adjusting its course, preparing to turn a tragedy into something else entirely. Grace pulled her jacket tighter and headed for the bus stop. She had a job to get to, a future to build, and a heart that refused to stop believing in second chances, even when first chances had nearly destroyed her. The morning sun climbed higher, casting long shadows across the asphalt. In a few hours, those shadows would shift, and everything would change. Have you ever wondered what truly makes someone wealthy? What do you think defines a person's real worth? The rain started as James merged onto the highway, each drop striking his windshield like a countdown to something he couldn't name. The Porsche's engine purred beneath him, a mechanical heartbeat that drowned out the silence of his thoughts. He'd left the penthouse without breakfast, without coffee, without the armor of his daily routine. The meeting with the board could wait. Everything could wait. His phone buzzed in the cup holder. Another call from his assistant, probably about the Henderson acquisition. The numbers on the screen blurred as he glanced down. Revenue projections. Market analysis. The language of his life. All of it meaningless when you had no one to share the victories with. The speedometer climbed past 70. Past 80. The rain was coming harder now, turning the world outside into watercolor smears of gray and green. Other cars became distant lights in his peripheral vision, their drivers living lives he couldn't imagine, going home to families, to people who would ask about their day and actually want to hear the answer. He thought about his father's funeral 3 years ago. The church had been full, but not with mourners. Business associates. Networking opportunities. People who shook his hand and offered condolences that felt like sales pitches. He'd stood at the grave alone, surrounded by hundreds, and realized he was looking at his own future. The curve appeared suddenly through the rain-soaked windshield. Highway 94's notorious bend, the one the local news warned about during every storm. James's hands gripped the steering wheel tighter, but his mind was elsewhere, lost in the memory of his father's last words. "You became everything I taught you to be, son. God help you." The Porsche hit the standing water at 85 miles per hour. Time fractured. The car lifted, weightless for a moment that lasted forever. James felt the steering wheel spin uselessly in his hands, the pedals useless beneath his feet. Through the windshield, he saw the guardrail approaching like a silver ribbon, and beyond it, the 30-foot drop into the ravine below. This was it. This was how it ended. Alone. Fast. Efficient. Maybe it was better this way. The impact threw him against the driver's side door, then forward into the airbag that exploded like a white flower of violence. The world spun, metal screaming, glass shattering, the taste of copper in his mouth. The car rolled once, twice, coming to rest against an oak tree that had stood in this spot for longer than James had been alive. Silence. Heavy and complete. Grace was 3 minutes behind him on the same stretch of highway when she saw the skid marks. She'd been thinking about the new job, running through potential scenarios in her mind. Rich clients could be demanding, entitled, used to people who said yes to everything. But she'd handled difficult patients before. Kindness was a universal language, even among people who'd forgotten how to speak it. The bus had been late, making her miss her connection. The temp agency had approved a taxi for the emergency placement, and the driver, a kind older man named Robert, had been telling her about his daughter's wedding when they saw the fresh gouges in the asphalt. "Jesus," Robert whispered, pulling over. "That just happened." Grace saw the broken guardrail, the fresh scar in the earth where something heavy had torn through. Without thinking, she was out of the taxi, running toward the edge in her white sneakers and clean scrubs. The Porsche was crumpled against the tree like an accordion, steam rising from its hood. The driver's side was crushed, but she could see movement inside. A hand, pressed against the spider-webbed window. Fingers that flexed once, then went still. "Call 911, she shouted back to Robert, then half ran, half slid down the muddy embankment. The rain had turned the earth into a slick brown river, but Grace's feet found purchase on roots and stones. Her nursing training kicked in, assessed the scene, checked for immediate dangers, prioritized life over everything else. The car wasn't smoking, but the smell of gasoline was sharp in the air. She reached the driver's side and peered through the shattered window. The man inside was conscious but dazed, blood running from a cut on his forehead. Expensive suit, expensive car, expensive watch, but none of it mattered now. He was just another human being who needed help. "Sir? Can you hear me?" Grace's voice was steady, professional. "My name is Grace. I'm a nurse. I'm going to get you out of here." James's eyes focused on her face. Through the haze of shock and pain, he saw something he hadn't seen in years. Genuine concern with no agenda behind it. She didn't know who he was, didn't know about his money or his company or his empty penthouse. She just saw someone who was hurt. "I can't." He tried to speak, but his voice came out as a whisper. "I can't move my legs." "That's okay," Grace said, her hands already working to clear the glass from the window frame. "Sometimes that happens with shock. We're going to take this slow." She pulled off her jacket and used it to protect her hands as she widened the opening. The man's seatbelt was jammed, the buckle twisted from the impact. Grace reached across him, her face inches from his, and he caught her scent. Not perfume or expensive cosmetics, but something clean and real. Soap. Shampoo. The smell of someone who worked for a living. "What's your name?" she asked, working to free the belt. "James," he said, and realized it was the first time in months someone had asked his name just to know it, not to use it. "Okay, James. I need you to stay calm. The ambulance is coming, but we're going to get you out of here first." This car could shift. Her hands were small but strong, calloused from work he couldn't imagine. When she finally freed the seatbelt, James felt something he hadn't experienced in years. The simple relief of being cared for without condition or expectation. "I'm going to pull you out now," Grace said. "It might hurt, but I need you to trust me." Trust. The word hung in the air between them like a bridge over an impossible distance. James looked into her eyes, brown and warm and completely unafraid, and nodded. Grace braced herself and pulled, her arms around his chest, her cheek pressed against his temple. For a moment, they were suspended there, stranger and stranger, held together by necessity and something deeper. His breath was warm against her neck, and she could feel his heartbeat, strong and steady against her ribs. They emerged from the wreckage together, Grace supporting most of his weight as they climbed away from the car. At the top of the embankment, she lowered him gently to the ground, her hands checking for obvious injuries while her eyes searched his face. "You're going to be okay," she said, and James believed her. The sirens were approaching now, but for this moment, it was just the two of them in the rain. A millionaire and a waitress. A man who had everything and a woman who had nothing. Two people who had saved each other in ways they couldn't yet understand. James reached up and touched her hand. "Thank you," he said, and meant it more than he'd ever meant anything. Grace squeezed his fingers. "That's what we're here for," she said. "To help each other." The ambulance arrived in a blaze of lights and noise, but James held onto her hand until the paramedics gently pulled them apart. As they loaded him onto the stretcher, he watched Grace through the rear window, standing in the rain with her ruined jacket and muddy scrubs, looking like the most beautiful thing he'd ever seen. Neither of them knew that this moment would change everything. That the car crash meant to end one story had actually begun another. That sometimes salvation comes not from above, but from the side of the road, in the form of a stranger who chooses to stop. The ambulance pulled away, carrying James toward whatever came next. Grace stood watching until the lights disappeared, then walked back to the taxi where Robert waited with a thermos of coffee and a blanket. "You saved his life," Robert said as she climbed in shivering. Grace shook her head. "I just did what anyone would do." But as they drove toward the city, she found herself thinking about the way James had looked at her. Not through her, not around her, but directly at her. Like she was someone worth seeing. It would be hours before she learned his name was James Whitmore. Before she understood that the man she'd pulled from the wreckage was the same wealthy client she'd been hired to care for. Before she realized that fate had a sense of humor and an agenda all its own. For now, she was just a woman who had chosen to help, and he was just a man who had been saved. The rest would come later, in ways neither of them could imagine. The hospital room smelled like antiseptic and false hope. James lay against the white pillows, his left leg elevated, his head wrapped in gauze that made him look more vulnerable than he'd appeared in 20 years. The doctors had been cautiously optimistic. Concussion, 3 cracked ribs, a fractured fibula. He'd live. He'd walk again. He'd been lucky. Lucky. The word felt foreign in his mouth as he stared at the ceiling tiles and tried to remember the face of the woman who'd pulled him from the wreckage. Brown eyes. Gentle hands. The way she'd said his name like it mattered. The door opened with a soft whoosh, and his world collapsed back into its familiar shape. "Jesus Christ, James. Do you have any idea what you've done?" Victoria Chun, his personal assistant, swept into the room like a sharply dressed hurricane, her heels clicking against the polished floor. Behind her came David Martinez, his head of security, and Paul Richardson, the company's crisis management specialist. The cavalry had arrived, and with them, the suffocating weight of his real life. "The stock dropped 12 points when news of the accident hit," Victoria continued, her fingers flying over her tablet. "The Henderson deal is on hold. The board is asking questions. We need to control the narrative." James closed his eyes. 3 hours ago, he'd been dying in a car with a stranger's hands pulling him toward safety. Now he was a stock price. A liability. A problem to be managed. "There was a witness," David said, consulting his own notes. "A woman who helped at the scene. We're trying to track her down." "Why?" James asked, his voice hoarse. "Liability issues," Paul interjected. "If she was injured helping you, we need to get ahead of any potential lawsuits. Plus, we want to make sure her story aligns with ours." "Her story?" James struggled to sit up straighter. "She saved my life." "Which is great for PR," Victoria said, not looking up from her tablet. "We'll send her a generous thank you gift. Maybe arrange a photo op when you're released. The press loves a good Samaritan story." James felt something cold settle in his chest. "She doesn't want publicity." "How do you know?" Paul asked. "Did she say something to you?" "No, I just—" James faltered. How could he explain that in those moments by the wreckage, he'd seen something pure in her eyes? Something that couldn't be bought or managed or spun into a narrative. She wasn't looking for anything. She just helped. Victoria finally looked up, her expression carefully neutral. "James, I know the accident was traumatic, but we need to think clearly here. Everyone wants something. Our job is to figure out what that something is before it becomes a problem." The room fell silent except for the steady beep of the heart monitor. James watched his team, people he paid handsomely to protect his interests, and felt the walls closing in. This was his life. This was what he'd built. A machine that turned human moments into transactions, that viewed kindness as a potential threat to be neutralized. "Find her," he said finally. "But not for a lawsuit. I want to thank her properly." Victoria nodded, already typing. "We'll arrange something tasteful. Flowers, maybe a small financial." "No." James's voice was sharper than he'd intended. I want to thank her myself. Privately. The look that passed between Victoria and Paul spoke volumes. Their employer was being irrational, emotional, compromised by trauma. They'd humor him for now, but they'd also prepare for damage control. Of course, Victoria said smoothly. We'll make the arrangements. As his team filed out, discussing security protocols and media strategies, James stared at the window and wondered what Grace was doing right now. Whether she was thinking about the accident, about him, about the moment when two strangers had become something more than strangers. He didn't know that she was 6 blocks away, standing in the break room of St. Mary's Hospital, staring at her phone in disbelief. Grace Martinez? The voice on the other end was crisp, professional. This is Victoria Chun from Whitmore Industries. I understand you assisted James Whitmore at the scene of his accident this morning. Grace's stomach dropped. Whitmore Industries. She'd heard the name before, seen it on billboards and in news articles. Technology. Innovation. Billions of dollars. The kind of wealth that made people untouchable. Yes, Grace managed. Is he okay? Mr. Whitmore is recovering well, thanks to your quick thinking. He's expressed a desire to thank you personally for your heroic actions. Heroic actions. The words felt wrong, overblown. Grace had done what anyone would do. What she'd been trained to do. There was nothing heroic about basic human decency. That's not necessary, Grace said. I'm just glad he's going to be okay. Nevertheless, Mr. Whitmore is quite insistent. We'd like to arrange a meeting at your convenience. Perhaps this afternoon. We can send a car. Grace's mind raced. This afternoon, she was supposed to start her new job. The temporary placement with the wealthy client who needed post-accident care. The irony wasn't lost on her. She'd saved a millionaire in the morning and was being hired to care for another one in the afternoon. I actually have a work commitment, Grace said. Maybe another time? There was a pause. Of course. We'll work around your schedule. May I ask where you're employed? We want to make sure there are no conflicts. Warning bells went off in Grace's head. She'd heard this tone before, from Patrick and his friends. The subtle probing disguised as politeness. The way wealthy people gathered information like weapons. I work several places, Grace said carefully. I should get back to my shift. Of course. We'll be in touch. The line went dead, and Grace stared at her phone. She thought about James's face in the car, the way he'd looked at her like she was someone worth seeing. Had that been real? Or was she just another problem for his people to solve? Her phone buzzed with a text from the temp agency. Client address, 4200 Meridian Tower, penthouse. Ask for James Whitmore. Grace's hands went numb. James Whitmore. The man she'd pulled from the wreckage. The man whose assistant had just called her. The man she was supposed to care for. She sat down heavily in the plastic break room chair, her mind reeling. This wasn't coincidence. This couldn't be coincidence. But what did it mean? Another text. Client preferences. Discreet, professional, no personal questions. Previous nurse terminated for overstepping boundaries. Grace's chest tightened. Overstepping boundaries. She'd held his hand at the accident scene. She'd pressed her cheek against his temple as she pulled him from the car. She'd looked into his eyes and seen something real, something vulnerable and human. Had that been overstepping boundaries? She thought about Victoria Chen's voice, cool and calculating. About the way Patrick's world had closed ranks around him when she'd become inconvenient. About the careful distance wealthy people maintained from the staff who served them. Grace stood up and walked to the window. The city sprawled below her, full of people going about their lives, unaware that a simple act of kindness had just become complicated. She'd saved a man's life this morning. Now she was supposed to pretend it had never happened. Her phone rang. Victoria Chen again. Ms. Martinez? I hope I'm not disturbing you. I wanted to follow up on our conversation. I'm listening. We've done some research, and we understand you work for Healing Hands Medical Services. Excellent reputation. We've actually arranged for their services ourselves. Grace's blood ran cold. For what? Mr. Whitmore will need in-home care during his recovery. We specifically requested someone experienced with trauma cases. I believe you're being assigned to his case." The trap was elegant and complete. Grace could see it now. The way they'd maneuvered her into position made her part of their carefully controlled narrative. She wasn't a good Samaritan anymore. She was an employee. Someone who could be managed, directed, contained. "I'm not sure that's appropriate," Grace said, "given what happened this morning. On the contrary, we think it's perfect. You already have Mr. Whitmore's trust. You understand his condition. It's really quite ideal. And if I refuse the assignment?" Another pause. "That's your choice, of course. Though I should mention that Whitmore Industries has several partnerships with medical service companies. We value reliability in our contractors." The threat was subtle but clear. Refuse and word would get around. Grace would be labeled difficult, unreliable, someone who couldn't be trusted with important clients. In her industry, reputation was everything. "I see," Grace said quietly. "Wonderful. We'll expect you at 4 o'clock. Security will have your name at the front desk." This time, Grace hung up first. She stood in the break room, surrounded by the familiar sounds of the hospital, beeping monitors, soft conversations, the squeak of sneakers on linoleum. This was her world. Real, honest, uncomplicated. In a few hours, she'd enter another world entirely. One where her act of kindness had been transformed into a business transaction, where the man she'd saved was now her employer, where the moment of connection they'd shared had been rewritten as a professional obligation. Grace thought about James's hand in hers, the way he'd said thank you like he meant it. Had any of it been real? Or was she just another person in his orbit, useful for a moment and then discarded when the moment passed? She picked up her purse and headed for the door. She had a job to do, a role to play. The woman who'd pulled James Whitmore from the wreckage was gone, replaced by a professional caregiver who would maintain appropriate boundaries and ask no personal questions. But as she walked through the hospital corridors, Grace couldn't shake the feeling that she was walking away from something important. Something that might have been real before the lawyers and assistants and crisis managers got involved. The automatic doors opened, and she stepped into the afternoon sun. In a few hours, she'd see James again. But this time, she'd be the help. This time, she'd know her place. The thought made her chest ache in ways she couldn't name. The elevator to the penthouse moved so smoothly Grace almost didn't realize they were rising. 40 floors in less than 2 minutes, carrying her from the world she knew into one that existed in the clouds. Her reflection stared back from the polished steel doors. White scrubs pressed and professional, her hair pulled back in a neat ponytail, a medical bag slung over her shoulder. She looked like exactly what she was, the help. The doors opened with a whisper, revealing a marble foyer that was larger than her entire apartment. Everything was white and silver and glass, surfaces so clean they seemed to glow. A security guard in an expensive suit nodded at her. "Ms. Martinez, Mr. Whitmore is expecting you. Please follow me." They walked through rooms that belonged in a museum. Art that Grace recognized from textbooks hung on walls beside windows that offered views of the entire city. The furniture looked like it had never been used, the rugs like they'd never been walked on. It was beautiful and cold and completely lifeless. "Sir." The security guard knocked on a door at the end of a long hallway. "The nurse is here. Send her in." Grace's stomach clenched at the sound of James's voice. For hours ago, that same voice had whispered, "Thank you," in the rain. Now it carried the crisp authority of a man accustomed to being obeyed. The door opened, and Grace stepped into what was clearly the master bedroom. Floor-to-ceiling windows wrapped around 2 walls, offering a panoramic view of the city below. A king-sized bed dominated the center of the room, its white linens pristine except for the man lying propped against a mountain of pillows. James looked different here. Smaller somehow, despite the grandeur surrounding him. His dark hair was mussed, and the hospital gown had been replaced by expensive pajamas that only emphasized how pale he'd become. The bandage on his forehead stood out stark against his skin. Their eyes met, and for a moment, Grace saw a flicker of the man from the accident. Vulnerable, grateful, real. Then something shifted in his expression, a wall sliding into place. "Ms. Martinez," he said formally, "thank you for taking the assignment." "Mr. Whitmore." Grace's voice was equally professional. "I understand you were discharged this afternoon. How are you feeling?" "Like I was in a car accident." A ghost of a smile played at his lips, then disappeared. "The doctors said you have experience with trauma cases." "I do." Grace set her medical bag on the nightstand, careful not to touch anything unnecessarily. "I've reviewed your discharge notes. Concussion protocol, mobility restrictions, pain management. I'll need to check your vitals and assess your current condition." It was surreal, talking to him like a stranger. Like she hadn't held his hand while paramedics loaded him onto a stretcher. Like she hadn't felt his heartbeat against her ribs when she pulled him from the wreckage. Grace pulled out her stethoscope and blood pressure cuff, her movements crisp and efficient. "May I?" James nodded, and Grace leaned in to wrap the cuff around his arm. Her fingers brushed his wrist as she positioned it, and she felt him tense. The same electricity that had sparked between them at the accident scene was still there, crackling beneath the surface of their professional facade. 140/90, Grace said, stepping back. Elevated, but not unexpected given the circumstances. Circumstances. James's voice was dry. "Is that what we're calling it?" Grace's hands stilled on her equipment. "I'm sorry." "Nothing." James looked away, toward the windows where the city sparkled in the afternoon sun. "How long will this arrangement last?" "As long as you need care. A few days, maybe a week. It depends on how quickly you heal. And then you'll go back to your life, and I'll go back to mine." There was something in his tone that made Grace's chest tighten. Not dismissal, exactly, but a kind of resigned acceptance that made her want to reach out and touch his hand. She didn't. "That's generally how these assignments work, yes." James nodded, still not looking at her. "Victoria mentioned you work at several places. Where else?" Grace hesitated. Personal questions weren't supposed to be part of this, but the alternative was standing in uncomfortable silence. "I work at Murphy's Diner downtown, and I pick up shifts at Mercy General when they need extra staff. That's a lot of work. I'm saving for school. Nursing program at the community college." Now James did look at her, his expression unreadable. "You're not already a nurse?" "I'm an LPN, licensed practical nurse. But I want to get my RN, maybe eventually become a nurse practitioner." Grace felt heat rise in her cheeks. Why was she telling him this? "The program starts in the fall." "That's impressive," James said, and it sounded genuine. "Working full-time and going to school. People do what they have to do." The words hung between them, loaded with implications. People like her had to work multiple jobs to afford dreams that people like him took for granted. Grace immediately regretted saying it, but James didn't look offended. If anything, he looked thoughtful. "Can I ask you something?" James's voice was quieter now, less formal. "Of course. This morning, when you helped me, did you know who I was?" Grace met his eyes. "No. You were just someone who needed help. And now?" The question was simple, but Grace sensed everything hanging on her answer. She could lie, tell him it didn't matter, that he was just another client. Or she could tell the truth, that knowing who he was changed everything and nothing at the same time. "Now you're my patient," she said finally. "That's what matters." James studied her face for a long moment. "Right. You're patient." An awkward silence settled over them. Grace busied herself checking his medication schedule, reviewing the physical therapy exercises he'd been prescribed. Anything to avoid the weight of his gaze. "I should probably explain the routine," Grace said. "I'll be here during the day, usually 8 to 6. There's a night nurse who'll cover the evening shift. I'll help with mobility, make sure you're taking your medications on schedule, assist with meals and personal care as needed." Personal care. James's eyebrows rose slightly. "Nothing inappropriate," Grace said quickly, feeling her cheeks burn. "Just if you need help getting to the bathroom, or showering, or—" "I understand." James's voice was gentler now. "I'm sorry. I didn't mean to make you uncomfortable." "You didn't." I just want to be clear about boundaries. Boundaries. The word felt heavy between them, a reminder of all the reasons they were supposed to maintain distance. Employer and employee. Rich and poor. Someone who owned penthouses and someone who cleaned them. Grace's phone buzzed. A text from the temp agency. How's the first day going? Client satisfied with your services? Everything all right? James asked, noticing her expression. Just checking in with my supervisor. Grace put the phone away. They want to make sure you're satisfied with the arrangement. Are you satisfied with it? The question caught her off guard. In her experience, clients didn't ask about her satisfaction. They asked if she could start earlier, stay later, do things that weren't technically part of her job description. I'm here to take care of you, Grace said. That's all that matters. That's not what I asked. Grace looked at him, really looked. His hair was still mussed from the hospital pillow. There was a vulnerability in his eyes that his expensive surroundings couldn't hide. He looked like a man who'd been asking the wrong questions for so long that a simple, honest answer might surprise him. It's complicated, Grace said finally. Because of this morning? Because of everything. James nodded slowly, as if he understood exactly what she meant. The money, the power imbalance, the way his people had maneuvered her into this position, the fact that she'd saved his life and now she was being paid to save it again, one day at a time. Grace. His voice was soft, almost hesitant. Yes. Thank you. For this morning. I don't think I said it properly before. You said it fine. No, I didn't. I was in shock, and then my people took over, and everything got complicated. But I need you to know, what you did was. He paused, searching for words. It was the most genuine thing anyone's done for me in years. Grace felt something crack open in her chest. This was the man from the accident. Not the billionaire, not the client, just James. The person who'd looked at her like she mattered. Anyone would have done the same thing, she said. No, James said firmly. They wouldn't have. Most people would have called 911 and kept driving. You got out of your car in the rain and risked your safety for a complete stranger. That's not anyone. That's you. The silence that followed was different from before, charged with possibility and danger in equal measure. Grace was acutely aware of how alone they were, how his gratitude felt like an invitation to step closer to something that could destroy her professionally. I should check your incision, she said, breaking the moment. The doctor wants to make sure there's no infection. James nodded, pulling up his shirt to reveal a line of stitches along his ribs. Grace leaned in with clinical detachment, examining the wound for signs of inflammation. But her proximity to him made her pulse quicken. She could smell his cologne, could see the way his breathing changed when she touched the skin around the stitches. It looks good, she said, stepping back quickly. Healing well. Grace. She looked at him and saw something in his expression that made her breath catch. I'm glad it was you, he said simply. This morning and now. I'm glad it was you. Before Grace could respond, footsteps echoed in the hallway outside. Victoria Chen's voice carried through the door, sharp and efficient. James, I'm coming in. We need to discuss the press statement. Grace moved away from the bed immediately, busying herself with her medical supplies. By the time Victoria entered, flanked by the same men from the hospital, Grace had transformed back into the professional caregiver, invisible and appropriate. How is he? Victoria asked, not looking at Grace directly. Stable, Grace replied. Following doctor's orders. Excellent. James, we need to finalize the story for tomorrow's news cycle. Simple accident, quick recovery, grateful for the community support. No need to go into details about specifics. Grace understood. She was the specifics. The complication that needed to be managed, contained, forgotten. I'll be in the kitchen, Grace said quietly. Preparing your afternoon medications. She left the room with as much dignity as she could muster, but she could feel James's eyes on her back as she walked away. In the hallway, she heard Victoria's voice, cool and controlling. She seems competent. Just remember, she's here to do a job. Nothing more. Grace reached the kitchen, a gleaming monument to appliances that probably cost more than her car, and leaned against the marble counter. She closed her eyes and tried to remember why she'd taken this job. The money, the opportunity, the future it would help her build. But all she could think about was the way James had said her name, like it meant something, like she meant something, and how dangerous that was for both of them. Grace had been working for James for 3 days when she found the photograph. She wasn't snooping, at least, that's what she told herself. James had asked her to retrieve his laptop from the study, and she'd simply followed his directions down the hall to the room he'd described as the one with books. What she found was a library that belonged in a mansion, floor-to-ceiling shelves filled with volumes that looked more decorative than read. The laptop sat on a mahogany desk beside a pile of mail that Victoria had obviously pre-sorted. Business correspondence in one stack, personal items in another much smaller pile. It was reaching for the computer that Grace knocked over the picture frame, sending it clattering to the desk's surface. She picked it up to straighten it and froze. The photograph showed a much younger James, maybe 25, standing beside an older man who shared his dark hair and intense eyes. Both wore tuxedos, both held champagne glasses, both were smiling. But there was something forced about James's expression, a tightness around his eyes that spoke of obligation rather than joy. What stopped Grace wasn't the image itself, but the newspaper clipping tucked behind the frame. The headline was stark black letters. Tech mogul Harold Whitmore found dead in apparent suicide. Grace's hands trembled as she read the article's opening lines. Harold Whitmore, 58, founder and CEO of Whitmore Industries, had been found in his downtown office with a gunshot wound to the head. The preliminary investigation suggested suicide, though the family had requested privacy during their time of grief. The article mentioned that Harold's son, James, 29, was expected to take over leadership of the company. The greatest irony, the quote continued, is that Harold Whitmore spent his life connecting people through technology, yet died alone, having alienated everyone who mattered to him. Grace set the frame down carefully, her heart racing. She thought about James lying in that hospital bed, accepting what he thought was his death with resignation rather than fear. About the way he'd spoken about his life, empty, transactional, isolated. Find what you were looking for. Grace spun around to find James leaning heavily on a crutch in the doorway. His face was pale, whether from the exertion of walking or from catching her with the photograph, she couldn't tell. "I'm sorry," Grace said immediately. "I knocked it over by accident, and then I saw the article about my father." James's voice was flat, matter of fact. "Don't apologize. It's not exactly a secret." He made his way slowly to the desk, favoring his injured leg. Grace noticed he didn't look at the photograph as he lowered himself into the leather chair. 3 years ago, James said, staring out the window rather than at her. The company was facing some legal issues. SEC investigation, fraud allegations. Nothing that couldn't be handled, but the stress was. He paused. "My father wasn't good with stress." "James, you don't have to. The funny thing is, he taught me everything about business. How to read people, how to find their weaknesses, how to get what you want from them. He was brilliant at it. Ruthless. But he never taught me how to connect with people without an agenda." James's laugh was bitter. Maybe because he never learned himself. Grace remained silent, sensing that James needed to tell this story as much as she needed to hear it. "The night before he died, we had dinner. Just the two of us, which was unusual. He seemed different, calmer. He told me he was proud of what I'd built, what I'd accomplished. I thought he was talking about the company." James finally looked at Grace. "But I think he was talking about how well I'd learned to be alone." "You're not alone," Grace said softly. "Aren't I?" James gestured around the opulent room. "Look at this place. Look at my life. I have employees, not friends. Business associates, not family. People who want things from me, not people who want me." Grace thought about the warmth in Mrs. Chen's voice when she called her Mija, about Miguel leaving quarters in the tip jar, about the construction workers who knew how she liked her coffee. Her world was small and sometimes struggled, but it was filled with people who cared about her without expecting anything in return. "It doesn't have to be that way," she said. "Doesn't it?" James leaned back in his chair. "When was the last time someone helped me without wanting something? Besides you, I mean. And look what happened. My people turned even that into a business arrangement." The pain in his voice was raw, unguarded. Grace took a step closer, then stopped herself. She was supposed to maintain boundaries, keep things professional. But how could she be professional when he was bleeding emotion all over his father's memory? "He left me a note," James continued. "One line. You became everything I taught you to be, son. God help you." I didn't understand it then. I thought he was proud that I could handle the company, that I could be strong. And now I think he was apologizing for turning me into someone who couldn't save him because I didn't know how to love him. Grace's chest ached. She thought about James in the car, accepting death with quiet resignation. About the way he'd looked at her when she pulled him out, like he'd never expected anyone to risk themselves for him. "James," she said, and her voice was gentler than any professional caregivers should be. "You can't blame yourself for your father's choices. Can I? I was so focused on proving I could run the company that I never noticed he was drowning. I was in the building that night, 3 floors down, working on merger documents while James's voice broke slightly. While he was deciding that leaving was easier than staying. Grace moved without thinking, crossing to his chair and kneeling beside it. She placed her hand over his, the same way she had at the accident scene, and felt him tense. "That's not your fault," she said firmly. "Depression, despair, those are illnesses. You couldn't have fixed them with love alone. Maybe not, but I never tried." James looked down at their joined hands. "I learned how to build walls instead of bridges. How to protect myself instead of protecting others. How to be successful instead of how to be human." Grace was quiet for a moment, studying his profile. "Is that why you weren't fighting? In the car, I mean. You seemed almost accepting." James nodded slowly. "It felt like justice. Like maybe I was getting what I deserved. And now I don't know." He turned his hand over, palm up, so their fingers could intertwine. "You changed something when you pulled me out of that car. You made me want to live, and I haven't felt that in a long time." Grace's breath caught. This was dangerous territory, emotional intimacy that crossed every professional line she was supposed to maintain. But looking at James, seeing the vulnerability he was offering her like a gift, she couldn't bring herself to pull away. "Can I tell you something?" she asked. "Please." Grace took a deep breath. "I was engaged once. To someone like you, actually. Wealthy, powerful, used to getting what he wanted." James's expression shifted, becoming more guarded. "What happened?" "Patrick Morrison. His family owns Morrison Construction. You probably know the name. We met when I was working at a charity gala, serving drinks to people who spent more on jewelry than I made in a year." Grace's voice took on a bitter edge. "He was charming, attentive. Made me feel like Cinderella, like I belonged in his world. But you didn't? Not according to his mother. Or his friends. Or eventually him." Grace pulled her hand free, suddenly self-conscious. "For 2 years, he tried to remake me. Better clothes, better speech patterns, better background story. He wanted me to quit working, to focus on being the right kind of girlfriend for a man in his position." James was listening intently, his expression unreadable. "The final straw was when he asked me to sign a prenup that included a morality clause," Grace continued. "Behavioral guidelines for how a Morrison wife should conduct herself. I was supposed to be grateful. He was elevating me, after all. Saving me from my ordinary life." "Jesus," James breathed. "I gave him back the ring and walked away. Lost the apartment he was paying for, the car he'd leased for me, the life he'd built around me. But I kept my dignity." Grace met James's eyes. "Ever since then, I've been careful around wealthy men. They have a way of making you feel special until you become inconvenient." The room fell silent except for the quiet hum of air conditioning and the distant sounds of the city below. Grace wondered if she'd said too much, revealed too much. But James deserved to know why she was holding back, why his gratitude and kindness scared her as much as they attracted her. "I'm not Patrick," James said finally. "I know," Grace replied. "But you're still you, and I'm still me. And when this assignment ends, you'll go back to your world, and I'll go back to mine. What if I don't want to go back?" The question hung between them like a bridge over a chasm. Grace could see the sincerity in James's eyes, the hope and fear warring in his expression. She could also see the impossibility of it, the penthouse around them, the team of handlers who managed his life, the gulf between their experiences that no amount of good intentions could completely bridge. "People like you don't change," Grace said softly. "Not really. Not permanently." "People like me," James repeated. "You mean rich people? Powerful people?" "I mean people who've never had to choose between groceries and textbooks. People who've never had their lights shut off because they couldn't pay the bill. People who think poverty is a character flaw instead of a circumstance." James flinched as if she'd struck him. "Is that what you think of me?" Grace studied his face, the genuine hurt there, the confusion. "I think you're a good man who was raised in a bad system. I think you want to be different, but wanting isn't the same as being able to. Then help me learn." The words were simple, but they carried weight that made Grace's chest tight. "Help me learn." Not "I'll figure it out," or "I can change on my own," but an admission of need that must have cost him everything to voice. "James," Grace started, but he held up a hand. "I know what you're thinking. That this is temporary, that I'll get bored or uncomfortable, or my people will talk me out of it. And maybe you're right. Maybe I'm not strong enough to change." James leaned forward in his chair. "But what if I am? What if you pulling me from that wreckage was about more than saving my life? What if it was about saving who I could become?" Grace felt tears prick her eyes. She wanted to believe him, wanted to trust that the connection between them was strong enough to overcome the obstacles in their path. But she'd believed Patrick too, and that had nearly destroyed her. "I can't be your project," she said. "I can't be the thing that proves you're a good person. I won't be convenient for you when it's easy and disposable when it's not. You think that's what this is? I think you're grateful, and you're confusing gratitude with something deeper. I think when your ribs heal and your head clears and your life goes back to normal, you'll remember that I'm the nurse who took care of you, not the woman who could share your world." James was quiet for a long moment, and Grace could see him processing her words, weighing them against his own feelings. "Maybe you're right," he said finally. "Maybe I am confused. But confusion is better than emptiness, Grace. For the first time in years, I'm feeling something other than obligation and guilt. That has to count for something." Before Grace could respond, her phone rang. The sharp sound cut through the intimate atmosphere like a blade, reminding them both of the professional boundaries they'd been crossing. Grace glanced at the screen and felt her heart sink. Victoria Chun. "I should take this," she said, standing and moving toward the door. "Grace." James's voice stopped her. "Thank you. For telling me about Patrick. For trusting me with that." Grace nodded, not trusting her voice, and stepped into the hallway to answer the call. "Ms. Martinez? This is Victoria Chun. I wanted to check on Mr. Whitmore's progress." "He's healing well," Grace said, her professional mask sliding back into place. "Following all medical protocols." "Excellent. And you're maintaining appropriate boundaries? No personal conversations or complications?" Grace looked back toward the study, where James sat surrounded by the ghosts of his father's legacy and the weight of his own isolation. "Everything is completely professional," Grace lied. "Wonderful. Keep up the good work." The line went dead, and Grace stood in the hallway, feeling like a traitor to both her professional obligations and her personal feelings. She just shared her deepest shame with a man she was supposed to be caring for, and he'd offered her his heart in return. The smart thing would be to request reassignment, to walk away before either of them got hurt worse than they already had been. But as she heard James moving around in the study, probably putting his father's photograph back in its place of honor and shame, Grace realized she couldn't leave him alone with his ghosts. Not yet. Sometimes our greatest pain becomes our greatest teacher. What moments in your life have shaped who you are today? The thunderstorm hit on Friday evening, turning the city into a watercolor painting scene through rain-streaked windows. Grace had planned to leave at 6 as usual, but the weather was vicious enough that James insisted she wait it out. The night nurse had called in sick anyway, something about her daughter's fever, and Grace found herself agreeing to stay overnight. "I can sleep on the couch," she said, eyeing the leather monstrosity in the living room that probably cost more than her car. Absolutely not. James was moving better now, the crutches replaced by a walking stick that made him look distinguished rather than injured. "There's a guest room down the hall. It has its own bathroom, everything you'll need." Grace wanted to argue, but the rain was coming down in sheets that made the windows look like waterfalls. The idea of traveling across the city in this weather, then getting up early to come back, was exhausting. "Just for tonight," she said. "Just for tonight," James agreed, but something in his tone suggested he hoped otherwise. By 7 o'clock, they'd fallen into an oddly domestic routine. James had insisted on cooking. "I can manage pasta. I'm not completely helpless," while Grace made a salad from vegetables she found in his ridiculously overstocked refrigerator. The kitchen felt different in the evening light, warmer somehow, as if the expensive appliances had finally found their purpose. "You know," James said, stirring marinara sauce with more concentration than the task required, "I haven't cooked for anyone in probably 5 years." "You haven't cooked for me," Grace pointed out, tossing the salad. "I'm technically still working." "Are you?" James glanced at her over his shoulder. She'd changed out of her scrubs into jeans and a sweater she kept in her bag for emergencies. Her hair was down for the first time since he'd known her, falling in soft waves around her shoulders. She looked less like a medical professional and more like someone he might have met in a completely different life. "I'm here, aren't I?" Grace said, but her tone was gentle, teasing rather than defensive. "Yes, but are you here as my nurse, or are you here as Grace?" The question hung between them as James drained the pasta and Grace set plates on the breakfast bar. It was the kind of question that could shatter the careful balance they'd maintained all week, forcing them to acknowledge what was growing between them. "Both," Grace said finally. "Is that allowed?" "I don't know," James admitted. "I've never tried it before." They ate in comfortable silence, the storm providing a soundtrack of rain and distant thunder. Grace noticed that James had simple tastes. The pasta was perfectly cooked but unseasoned, the sauce straight from a jar. There was something endearing about a man who owned restaurants but couldn't properly salt water. "This is nice," James said, as if the thought surprised him. "What, the food?" "Because I hate to break it to you, but this is basically cafeteria-level cuisine." James laughed, a real laugh that transformed his entire face. "Not the food. This. Sitting here, talking to someone who doesn't want anything from me." "I want things from you," Grace said without thinking, then felt her cheeks burn. "I mean professionally. I want you to take your medications on time and do your physical therapy exercises and—" "Grace." James's voice was soft. "It's okay." She met his eyes across the small table and saw understanding there. He knew what she'd meant, and he wasn't going to make her uncomfortable about the slip. "Tell me something," James said. "What do you do when you're not working? For fun, I mean." Grace considered the question. Fun felt like a luxury she couldn't afford most of the time. "I read. Go to the library on Sunday afternoons. Sometimes I meet my friend Carmen for coffee when our schedules align." "What do you read?" "Everything. Mysteries, romance novels, biographies. I've been working my way through the classics I never had time for in high school." Grace paused. "What about you?" "I work," James said simply. "Or I did before the accident. 16-hour days, 7 days a week. I told myself it was necessary, but really it was just easier than figuring out what else to do with my time." "That's not living, James. That's just existing." "I know that now." He reached across the table and touched her hand, a gesture that was becoming natural between them. "You've been teaching me the difference." Grace felt her pulse quicken at the contact, but she didn't pull away. "I haven't been teaching you anything. I've just been doing my job." No, you haven't. Your job is to monitor my vitals and dispense medications. But you've done so much more than that. James's thumb traced across her knuckles. You've talked to me like I'm a person instead of a diagnosis. You've shared pieces of yourself. You've made me feel human again. The words were dangerous, loaded with possibilities that Grace couldn't let herself fully consider. But sitting here in his kitchen, with the storm raging outside and warmth spreading through her chest, she found her defenses crumbling. You were always human, James. You just forgot for a while. Maybe. But I needed someone to remind me. Thunder crashed overhead, closer this time, and the lights flickered. Grace jumped slightly, and James's hand tightened over hers. It's just the storm, he said. I know. I've just never been this high up during weather like this. It feels different when you're so far from the ground. James studied her face. Are you afraid of heights? Not afraid, exactly. Just aware of them. When you grow up in a neighborhood where the tallest building is 3 stories, 40 floors feels like living in the clouds. Would you like to see something? Before Grace could answer, James was standing, still holding her hand. He led her through the living room to a door she hadn't noticed before, glass panels that opened onto a covered terrace. James, we can't go out there, Grace protested as he unlocked the door. The storm. We're not going out. Just look. He opened the door slightly, and Grace gasped. The terrace was protected by an overhang, but beyond its edge, the city stretched out in all directions, lights twinkling through the rain like fallen stars. Lightning illuminated the clouds from within, turning the sky into a kaleidoscope of purple and silver. It's beautiful, Grace breathed. I never noticed before, James said, standing close behind her. I mean, I knew it was there, but I never really looked at it. Not until you asked me what I do for fun, and I realized I couldn't remember the last time I just observed something beautiful without trying to figure out how to monetize it. Grace leaned back slightly, feeling the warmth of his body behind her. The gesture was unconscious, natural, and she realized how long it had been since she'd felt this kind of simple comfort with another person. When I was little, she said, my grandmother used to take me up to the roof of our apartment building during thunderstorms. She said storms were God's way of washing the world clean, getting rid of all the bad energy so beautiful things could grow. Did you believe her? I wanted to. She died when I was 12, and after that, storms just made me feel lonely. Grace turned in the circle of James's arms, not caring anymore about professional boundaries or class differences, or the voice in her head warning her to be careful. But tonight I think she might have been right. James's hands came up to frame her face, his thumbs brushing across her cheekbones. Grace. I know, she whispered. I know this is complicated and probably impossible and definitely against every rule I'm supposed to follow. But I can't pretend I don't feel it anymore. Whatever this is between us. James's eyes searched her face, as if looking for permission or maybe just confirmation that he wasn't imagining the electricity that sparked whenever they touched. What if my people are right? He asked. What if I'm just confused, grateful, not thinking clearly? Then we'll figure that out when your head clears, Grace said. But right now, in this moment, I need you to know that what I feel for you isn't professional obligation or pity or whatever Victoria thinks it is. It's real. Lightning flashed again, closer this time, and in its brief illumination, Grace saw something shift in James's expression. Hope, maybe. Or recognition. I've never felt anything like this before, he said quietly. Even before my father died, even when I thought I was happy, I never felt like someone truly saw me. Not until you pulled me out of that car and looked at me like I was worth saving. You are worth saving. Am I? Even with all my baggage? Even with the money and the complications and the fact that my world and yours are so different. Grace rose on her tiptoes, closing the distance between them until her forehead rested against his. Especially because of all that. You could have anyone, James. Anyone who would tell you what you want to hear, who would fit perfectly into your life without asking you to change or grow or become better. But you're here with me, the woman who challenges you and calls you on your bullshit, and makes you work for every moment of connection. Maybe that's what I need, James murmured, his lips so close to hers that she could feel his breath. Maybe I've been looking for easy when I should have been looking for real. Maybe we both have been. The kiss was inevitable, as natural as the storm raging around them. Soft at first, tentative, then deeper as Grace's hands fisted in his shirt and James pulled her closer. It tasted like possibility and risk, and the kind of connection that could either save them both or destroy everything they'd built separately. When they finally broke apart, both were breathing hard. Grace could feel her heart hammering against her ribs, could see her own wonder reflected in James's eyes. "Grace," he said, and her name sounded different in his voice now. Not like a caregiver or an employee, but like a woman he was falling in love with. "I know," she said again, because there were no words for what was happening between them. No protocols or procedures for how to navigate this territory. Another crash of thunder made them both jump, then laugh at their reaction. The spell wasn't broken exactly, but the moment had shifted from intense to intimate, from desperate to wondering. "We should go inside," Grace said, though she made no move to step away from him. "We should," James agreed, but his hands were still on her face, his thumbs still tracing patterns on her skin. "This changes everything," Grace said. "I know. Your people are going to hate this. Probably. And mine will think I've lost my mind. Have you?" Grace considered the question seriously. A week ago, she'd been focused on survival, paying bills, saving money, building a future one shift at a time. Now she was standing in a storm with a man she'd saved, letting him save her in return, and it felt like the sanest thing she'd ever done. "If I have, then so be it," she said. "Some kinds of crazy are worth it." James smiled, the real smile she was learning to recognize. "Come on," he said, taking her hand. "Let's go make some tea and pretend we're normal people who met under normal circumstances. And then what? Then we figure out how to make this work. One day at a time." They went inside together, leaving the storm to rage without them. In the kitchen, James filled the kettle while Grace found mugs and cabinets that probably cost more than her monthly rent. The domestic simplicity of it felt revolutionary. A billionaire and a waitress making tea together like it was the most natural thing in the world. "Grace," James said as they waited for the water to boil. "Yeah. Thank you. For what this time? For staying tonight. For not running when things got complicated. For looking at me and seeing someone worth the risk." Grace set down the mugs and walked over to him, rising on her toes to press a soft kiss to his cheek. "Thank you for being worth it." Outside, the storm was beginning to pass, but inside, something new was just beginning. Something fragile and precious and possibly doomed, but real in ways that neither of them had experienced before. As they sat at the breakfast bar with their tea, talking quietly about books and dreams and the small moments that make up a life, Grace realized that for the first time in years, she wasn't thinking about tomorrow's worries or yesterday's mistakes. She was simply here, in this moment, with this man who saw her truly and chose her anyway. It was enough. It was everything. Grace woke up to the sound of camera shutters and voices in the hallway. The guest room was filled with soft morning light, a stark contrast to the storm that had raged the night before. For a moment, she lay still, remembering the warmth of James's kiss, the way he'd looked at her like she was something precious. Then the voices grew louder, and reality crashed back in. Completely inappropriate. Reputation of the company. Need to contain this immediately. Grace's blood ran cold. She recognized Victoria Chen's clipped tones, but there were other voices too. Male voices, discussing her like she was a problem to be solved. She dressed quickly in yesterday's clothes, her hands shaking as she tried to make herself presentable. Whatever was happening, she needed to face it with whatever dignity she could muster. The hallway was full of people. Victoria stood near James's bedroom door with two men in expensive suits, while a photographer, an actual photographer, adjusted his equipment nearby. Grace's stomach dropped when she saw the morning newspapers spread across the hall table. The headline of the Tribune's gossip section screamed in bold letters, Whitmore's mystery woman. Billionaire's new live-in love interest identified. Below it was a photograph that made Grace's knees weak. Someone had captured her and James on the terrace the night before. Her in his arms, their faces inches apart, looking like lovers sharing an intimate moment. The image was grainy but unmistakable, taken with a telephoto lens from a building across the street. Ms. Martinez. Victoria's voice cut through Grace's shock like a blade. I think we need to talk. Grace picked up the newspaper with trembling hands. The article was worse than the headline. Sources close to Whitmore Industries confirm that tech billionaire James Whitmore, 32, has been conducting a romantic relationship with his hired caregiver, Grace Martinez, 29. Martinez, who works multiple service jobs including waitress at the downtown Murphy's Diner, has been living in Whitmore's penthouse since his car accident last week under the guise of medical care. The relationship raises questions about professional boundaries and potential exploitation. Martinez, who sources say grew up in subsidized housing and has no college education, may have seen an opportunity to improve her circumstances through her relationship with one of the city's wealthiest men. This wouldn't be the first time Whitmore has been linked to women from outside his social circle, though previous relationships were brief and discreet. Industry insiders wonder if the recent accident has affected the typically sharp businessman's judgment. Grace stopped reading. The words were swimming on the page anyway, blurred by tears she refused to let fall. Every fear she'd ever had about getting involved with someone like James was laid out in black and white, wrapped in implications that made her feel dirty and small. Where did this come from? Grace asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Does it matter? Victoria stepped closer, lowering her voice so the men behind her couldn't hear. The damage is done. James's reputation is compromised, the company's stock is already dropping, and you. Victoria's gaze was cold, calculating. You're going to become the most hated woman in the city. Gold digger. Social climber. Opportunist. That's not what this is, Grace said, but even as she said it, she could hear how it sounded. How it looked. A poor woman in a rich man's penthouse, crossing professional lines for personal gain. Isn't it? Victoria pulled out her phone, showing Grace a series of social media posts that had already started appearing. The comments were vicious, filled with assumptions about Grace's motives and character. This is what the world sees, Ms. Martinez. And this is what they'll keep seeing unless we handle this properly. Grace felt the walls closing in around her. This was Patrick all over again, but worse. At least with Patrick, the judgment had been private, contained to his social circle. This was public humiliation on a scale she'd never imagined. What do you want? Grace asked. Simple. You pack your things, you leave quietly, and you sign a non-disclosure agreement that prevents you from ever discussing your relationship with James. In return, we'll provide a generous severance package and excellent references for future employment. And if I don't? Victoria's smile was sharp as a knife. Then we let the media circus continue. How long do you think it will take before they dig into your past? Your family's financial troubles? Your father's drinking problem? Your mother's depression and suicide attempt when you were 16? Grace's face went white. How do you? We know everything, Ms. Martinez. We always do our research. Victoria's voice was almost gentle now, which somehow made it worse. You seem like a nice girl who got in over her head. Don't make this harder than it has to be. Where is James? Grace demanded. I want to talk to him. Mr. Whitmore is in meetings with the board, trying to contain the damage you've caused. He's asked not to be disturbed. The words hit Grace like a physical blow. James was in meetings. Damage control. Managing the crisis that she had become. Just like Patrick when things got complicated, when she became more liability than asset. He wouldn't, Grace started, but Victoria cut her off. Wouldn't what? Choose his company over a woman he's known for a week? Protect his reputation over a temporary infatuation? Ms. Martinez, you may have convinced yourself that this was something special, but James is a businessman first and always. He's making the smart choice. Grace stared at the newspaper again, at the photograph that had turned their moment of connection into something sordid and calculating. She thought about the way James had held her face in his hands, the way he'd said her name like it meant something. Had any of it been real, or was she just the latest in a series of brief, discreet relationships? "I need to get my things," Grace said quietly. Victoria nodded, her expression almost sympathetic. "Take your time. The car will be waiting to take you home when you're ready." Grace walked back to the guest room on unsteady legs, her mind reeling. She packed her few belongings mechanically, scrubs, toiletries, the book she'd been reading. Everything fit in the same small bag she'd brought a week ago, when this had seemed like just another job. As she zipped up the bag, she heard footsteps in the hallway. Her heart leaped. Maybe James had finished his meetings. Maybe he was coming to explain, to fight for what they'd found together. But the footsteps passed by without stopping. Grace sat on the edge of the perfectly made bed and let herself feel the full weight of what was happening. She'd known this was a possibility. Had warned James about it, even. Wealthy men didn't change their worlds for women like her. They had momentary diversions, temporary fascinations, but when push came to shove, they protected their real interests. She just hoped, stupidly, naively, that James might be different. A soft knock on the door made her look up. "Come in." But it wasn't James. It was one of Victoria's assistants, a young woman who looked almost apologetic as she held out a manila envelope. "The paperwork," she said quietly. "Miss Chin said to tell you that the severance package is very generous. Enough to cover your nursing school tuition and living expenses for the first year." Grace stared at the envelope. They'd thought of everything, hadn't they? Even turned her dreams into part of the transaction. Sign away her right to speak about James, and they'd pay for her future. Blood money wrapped in the guise of generosity. "I don't want it," Grace said. The assistant looked confused. "Ma'am, tell Miss Chun I don't want her money. Any of it." Grace stood up, shouldering her bag. "I'll find my own way home." She walked out of the guest room and down the hallway, past Victoria and her team of crisis managers, past the photographer who was probably documenting her departure for posterity. No one tried to stop her. The elevator ride down felt endless. 40 floors from the clouds back to earth, from fairy tale to reality. Grace stared at her reflection in the polished steel doors and saw exactly what the newspapers would see. A waitress in yesterday's clothes, fleeing the scene of her failed social climbing attempt. The lobby was buzzing with reporters and photographers who had somehow gotten past building security. Grace heard her name being called, saw camera flashes going off, but she kept walking toward the exit with her head held high. "Grace. Grace Martinez. Is it true you're being paid to keep quiet? What was your relationship with James Whitmore really like? Are you pregnant with his child?" The questions followed her onto the street, where more cameras waited. Grace pushed through the crowd, ignoring the microphones thrust in her face, the photographers jogging alongside her as she walked to the bus stop. Her phone was buzzing constantly. Unknown numbers, reporters trying to get her side of the story. Grace turned it off and sat at the bus stop bench, waiting for the number 12 that would take her back to her real life. The bus was half empty, filled with working people heading to second shifts and weekend jobs. Grace recognized some faces: Maria from the grocery store, Tom who worked security at the hospital. Normal people living normal lives. People who would probably see her in tomorrow's papers and shake their heads at another gold digger who got caught reaching too high. As the bus pulled away from downtown, Grace caught one last glimpse of Whitmore Tower in the side mirror. Somewhere up there, James was probably in another meeting, discussing how to minimize the scandal. Somewhere up there, Victoria was probably congratulating herself on handling a delicate situation with characteristic efficiency. And somewhere in that gleaming tower, Grace had left behind the first real happiness she'd felt in years. Her phone buzzed again, a text from an unknown number. Despite herself, she turned the phone back on to read it. "I'm sorry. I never meant for this to happen. Jay." Grace stared at the message for a long moment, then deleted it without responding. Sorry didn't undo the newspaper articles, or the humiliation, or the way his people had treated her like a problem to be solved. Sorry didn't change the fact that when the crisis hit, he'd chosen his boardroom over her bedroom. She'd saved his life once. She wouldn't save his conscience too. The bus carried her away from downtown, away from penthouses and possibilities, back to a world where she belonged. Back to a life where saving someone didn't make you a liability, where caring about people didn't come with a price tag attached. But as the city blurred past the window, Grace couldn't shake the memory of James's hands on her face, the way he'd looked at her like she was something precious. Had that been real? Or was she just another woman who'd convinced herself that a rich man's attention meant something more than entertainment? By the time the bus reached her neighborhood, Grace had made her decision. She would go back to her life, her jobs, her dreams, her carefully constructed independence. She would pretend that none of this had happened, that James Whitmore was just a name in the papers and not the man who had made her believe, for one perfect night, that love could conquer anything. Even if it was a lie she could live with. The alternative, hoping that he would fight for her, that he would choose love over security, was a heartbreak she might not survive. James stared at the boardroom full of faces that had defined his life for the past decade. Victoria sat at his right hand, her tablet displaying damage control strategies with military precision. The board members were arranged around the mahogany table like judges, their expressions ranging from disapproval to calculation. Everyone was talking at once. Stock has dropped 15 points. Henderson deal is dead in the water. Reputation management firm suggests a complete severance. Legal liability if the relationship was coercive. James let the voices wash over him without really listening. Through the floor-to-ceiling windows, he could see the city spreading out below, and somewhere in that maze of streets and buildings was Grace. The woman who had pulled him from wreckage twice. Once from twisted metal, once from the wreckage of his own life. The woman his people had just driven away like she was contaminated waste. James. Victoria's voice cut through his thoughts. Are you listening? No, James said quietly. I'm not. The room fell silent. Richard Henderson, the potential merger partner, leaned forward with the expression of a man who smelled weakness. Perhaps we should reconvene when Mr. Whitmore is feeling more focused, Henderson said, his tone suggesting that James had already proven himself an unreliable business partner. Actually, James said, standing slowly, his ribs still aching from the accident, I think my focus is clearer than it's been in years. Victoria's eyes narrowed slightly. James, maybe we should discuss this privately. No. James's voice was firm, carrying an authority that surprised even him. I want everyone to hear this. He walked to the windows, looking out at the city that had always felt like a kingdom he ruled, but never really lived in. When he spoke, his voice was steady, measured. 3 weeks ago, I was driving too fast in the rain because I was running away from a life that felt like a prison. I was planning to drive until I felt something other than empty, and I didn't care if that meant driving off a cliff. James turned back to face the room. The car crashed, and a woman I'd never met risked her life to pull me out of the wreckage. James, Victoria started, but he held up a hand. She didn't know who I was. Didn't know about the money or the company or any of this. James gestured around the boardroom. She just saw someone who needed help, and she helped. Without agenda. Without calculation. Without asking what was in it for her. Richard Henderson shifted uncomfortably. That's a lovely story, but what does it have to do with business? Everything, James said. Because for the first time in my adult life, someone cared about me without wanting something from me. And instead of protecting that, instead of fighting for the one real thing I've found in years, I sat in this room and let you treat her like a liability to be managed. Victoria's voice was carefully controlled. James, you're being emotional. The situation with Ms. Martinez was professionally inappropriate and potentially damaging. The situation with Grace, James interrupted, was me learning how to be human again. It was me discovering that there's more to life than profit margins and stock prices, and the approval of people who wouldn't cross the street to help a stranger. He looked around the table at faces he'd known for years, people he'd trusted with his professional life, but never his personal truth. "I built this company to connect people," James continued. "That was the original mission, remember? To bring people together across distances and differences. But somewhere along the way, I forgot how to connect with anyone myself. I built walls instead of bridges. I chose isolation over intimacy. I became exactly what my father was, successful and empty." The room was completely silent now. Even Victoria had stopped taking notes. Grace Martinez makes $40,000 a year working 3 jobs so she can afford nursing school. She gives free meals to families who can't pay. She stops in thunderstorms to help strangers. She has more integrity in her little finger than most of us have in our entire bodies. James's voice was growing stronger, more certain. "And you want me to cut her loose because dating her might hurt my reputation?" "James," Victoria said carefully, "be realistic. The media circus alone will pass," James finished. "Scandals always do. But regret? Missing the chance to be with someone who makes you want to be better than you are? That lasts forever." He walked back to his chair, but didn't sit down. Instead, he looked each board member in the eye, one by one. "Here's what's going to happen," James said. "I'm going to find Grace and apologize for being a coward. I'm going to tell her that I love her, and I'm going to ask her to give me another chance to prove that not all wealthy men are selfish bastards who run at the first sign of trouble." Victoria was typing furiously on her tablet. "James, if you pursue this relationship publicly, the board will have no choice but to." "Then do it," James said simply. "Fire me. Remove me as CEO. Take the company." The words hung in the air like a bomb that hadn't yet exploded. Victoria's fingers froze over her keyboard. "You don't mean that," Richard Henderson said. "I absolutely mean it." James pulled off his watch, a Rolex worth more than Grace's annual salary, and set it on the table. "I've spent 32 years building a life that looked successful from the outside, but felt like death on the inside. I almost died in that car crash, and you know what my last thought was? Relief. I was relieved that it was finally over." He looked around the room again, seeing the shock and confusion on faces that had never questioned his priorities before. "Grace saved my life twice. Once from the wreckage of that car, and once from the wreckage of my own soul. If choosing her means losing this company, then I lose the company. If it means losing my money, I lose the money. If it means starting over with nothing but the clothes on my back, then that's what I do." James picked up his jacket from the back of his chair and headed for the door. "Where are you going?" Victoria called after him. "To fight for something that actually matters," James replied without turning around. In the elevator down, James felt something he hadn't experienced in years: clarity. For the first time since his father's death, he knew exactly what he wanted and exactly what he was willing to sacrifice to get it. The elevator opened in the lobby, where a few persistent reporters were still hoping for a statement. James walked past them without comment, ignoring the shouted questions and camera flashes. Outside, his driver waited with the car, but James waved him off. He needed to think, needed to figure out how to find Grace, and what to say when he did. Most importantly, he needed to prove to her, and to himself, that he was willing to fight for their love instead of just managing it. Meanwhile, across the city, Grace was staring at her reflection in the bathroom mirror of Murphy's Diner. She'd been back at work for 2 hours, but her hands were still shaking. The other waitresses kept glancing at her with mixtures of sympathy and curiosity. Mrs. Chun had hugged her when she walked in, whispering in Spanish that rich men were all the same, that Grace was better off without the trouble. But Grace didn't feel better off. She felt hollow, scraped raw, like something vital had been torn away from her. Her phone had been buzzing constantly with calls from reporters and unknown numbers. She'd finally turned it off and left it in her locker. Whatever James wanted to say to her, whatever explanations or apologies he was crafting, she didn't want to hear them. Some mistakes were too big to apologize away. "Mija." Mrs. Chin appeared in the bathroom doorway, her weathered face creased with concern. You should go home. You look like you haven't slept." "I'm fine," Grace lied, splashing cold water on her face. "I need the money. The money will still be here tomorrow. Your heart won't heal if you don't give it time." Grace looked at Mrs. Chun in the mirror. This woman who had become like a grandmother to her, who had seen her through Patrick's betrayal and celebrated with her when she'd been accepted to nursing school. "How do you know when someone really loves you?" Grace asked quietly. "How do you know it's not just convenience or gratitude or novelty?" Mrs. Chun stepped into the bathroom and closed the door behind her. "Nina, love isn't about what someone says when things are easy. It's about what they do when things get hard." "He didn't do anything," Grace whispered. "When it got hard, when his world turned against me, he disappeared into meetings and let his people handle the mess I'd become." "And what would you have done if the situation was reversed?" Grace considered the question. If James had been the one under attack, if his reputation had been on the line, what would she have done? "I would have fought for him," Grace said without hesitation. "I would have stood up to anyone who tried to hurt him." "See," Mrs. Chin nodded, "because that's who you are. But maybe he doesn't know how to fight for love yet. Maybe no one ever taught him. That's not my job, to teach him." "No," Mrs. Chin agreed. "It's not your job. But sometimes love means giving someone the chance to learn. Sometimes it means being brave enough to believe they can be better than they've been." Grace turned to face the older woman. "What if he can't? What if this is who he really is? Someone who runs when things get complicated. Then you'll know, and you can move on with no regrets. But what if he can? What if he's sitting somewhere right now, trying to figure out how to prove to you that you're worth more to him than anything else?" Before Grace could respond, there was a commotion in the diner outside. Raised voices, the scrape of chairs, someone talking rapidly in Spanish. Mrs. Chun cracked the bathroom door and peered out, then turned back to Grace with wide eyes. "Nina," she said softly, "I think your answer just walked through the front door." Grace's heart stopped. "What?" "The man from the newspapers. The one with the sad eyes and expensive clothes. He's here, and he looks like he's ready to fight the whole world." Grace pushed past Mrs. Chun and peered through the crack in the door. There, standing in the middle of Murphy's diner like he'd stepped out of another universe, was James Whitmore. He was still wearing his business suit, but his tie was loosened and his hair was mussed like he'd been running his hands through it. He looked completely out of place among the vinyl booths and fluorescent lights, but he also looked determined in a way that made Grace's breath catch. "I'm looking for Grace Martinez," James was saying to Carmen, the afternoon shift supervisor. "Please, I need to talk to her." "She doesn't want to talk to you," Carmen replied, her arms crossed defensively. "Haven't you done enough damage?" "I know I have," James said, and his voice carried clearly across the small diner. "I know I've hurt her, and I know I don't deserve another chance. But I'm here anyway, because some things are worth fighting for even when you don't deserve them." The diner had gone completely quiet. Every customer, every employee, was watching this surreal scene unfold. A billionaire pleading his case in a working-class restaurant while cameras flashed outside the windows. Grace stepped out of the bathroom, her heart hammering against her ribs. James saw her immediately, and the relief that crossed his face was so profound that Grace felt her carefully constructed walls begin to crack. "Grace," he said, and her name sounded like a prayer. She looked at him across the diner. This man who had shown her what it felt like to be truly seen, who had made her believe in possibilities she'd thought were beyond her reach, who had then disappeared when those possibilities became inconvenient. The man who was now standing in her world, in front of everyone she cared about, looking like he was ready to burn down everything he'd built just to talk to her. "What are you doing here, James?" Grace asked, her voice steady despite the chaos in her chest. "I'm choosing you," James said simply. "I'm choosing you over the company, over the money, over the approval of people who don't matter. I'm choosing you over everything, and I'm hoping, God, I'm hoping, that it's not too late for you to choose me back." The silence in the diner was absolute. Grace could hear her own heartbeat, could feel the weight of every eye in the room. This was the moment. The choice that would define everything that came after. Grace looked at James, really looked at him. Not the billionaire from the newspapers, not the client she'd been hired to care for, but the man who had held her face in his hands during a thunderstorm and made her believe in love again. The man who was now risking everything for the chance to prove that some things mattered more than safety. "We need to talk," Grace said finally. James nodded, hope flickering in his eyes like a candle in the wind. "Yes," he said. "We do." They walked in silence to the small park 3 blocks from the diner, Grace leading the way through streets that James had probably never seen before. The October air was crisp, carrying the scent of fallen leaves and the promise of winter. Behind them, reporters followed at a respectful distance, their cameras clicking like mechanical insects. Grace chose a bench beside the old oak tree where she used to come to read when her apartment felt too small. It seemed fitting somehow, this place that had always been her refuge, now becoming the setting for whatever came next. James sat beside her carefully, leaving space between them that felt both necessary and heartbreaking. For a long moment, neither spoke. They just sat there, 2 people who had found something precious, and then watched it shatter, trying to figure out if the pieces could be put back together. "I resigned," James said finally. Grace turned to look at him, startled. "What?" "From the company. I called Victoria from the car. Effective immediately." James was staring straight ahead, his hands clasped in his lap. "I'm officially no longer the CEO of Whitmore Industries." "James, you can't." "I can, and I did." He looked at her then, and Grace saw something in his eyes she'd never seen before. Peace. Certainty. "I should have done it 3 years ago, when my father died. I should have walked away from a life that was killing me slowly and found something worth living for." Grace felt tears prick her eyes. "You built that company. It's your whole life." "No," James said softly. "It was my whole prison. There's a difference." A breeze stirred the leaves around their feet, and Grace pulled her jacket tighter. The reporters were still there, a respectful but persistent presence at the edge of the park. Their story was being written in real time, broadcast to a world that loved fairy tales and happy endings. "Why?" Grace asked. "Why throw it all away for someone you've known for barely a week?" James was quiet for so long that Grace thought he might not answer. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. "Do you remember what you said to me that first night? When I asked if you knew who I was? I said you were just someone who needed help." "Someone who needed help," James repeated. "Not someone who could be useful to you. Not someone whose money could solve your problems. Just someone who needed help." He turned his body toward her on the bench. "Grace, I've been James Whitmore, billionaire, for so long that I forgot I was ever just James. But you saw him anyway. You pulled him out of that wreckage and reminded him he was worth saving." Grace's chest was tight with emotions she couldn't name. "That doesn't mean you should give up everything." "Everything." James laughed, but it wasn't bitter. It was almost relieved. "Grace, I had nothing. I had money and power and influence, but I had no life. No real relationships. No joy. No purpose beyond accumulating more of what was already making me miserable." He reached out then, not quite touching her hand, but close enough that she could feel the warmth of his skin. "You want to know what everything looks like to me now? It's you reading to me when I couldn't sleep. It's cooking pasta together in my kitchen while it storms outside. It's the way you look at Mrs. Chun like she's family. The way you remember how Miguel likes his coffee. It's watching you choose kindness over self-preservation, again and again, like it's the most natural thing in the world." Grace felt a tear slip down her cheek. "James, I love you," he said simply. "Not the idea of you, not the novelty of dating someone from a different world. I love the woman who stops in thunderstorms to help strangers. I love your stubborn integrity and your gentle hands, and the way you make me want to be better than I've ever been." The words hung in the air between them, honest and raw and completely without artifice. Grace had heard men tell her they loved her before, but never like this. Never with the quiet certainty of someone stating a fundamental truth about the universe. "I love you too," Grace whispered, and felt something tight in her chest finally release. God help me, I love you too. James's smile was brilliant, transforming his entire face. Then that's all we need to figure out the rest. Is it? Grace wiped her cheek with the back of her hand. James, your people were right about one thing. We come from different worlds. I don't know anything about charity galas and board meetings, and I don't know anything about working 3 jobs to pay for school, or giving free meals to hungry families, or being genuinely kind without expecting something in return. James shifted closer on the bench. But we can learn each other's worlds. We can build something new together. Grace looked at him, really looked. His expensive suit was wrinkled from a day that had probably been the most emotionally honest of his adult life. His hair was mussed, his tie askew, and he looked more real than she'd ever seen him. What happens now? She asked. You can't just stop being James Whitmore. The money, the influence, it doesn't just disappear. No, it doesn't. But how I use it can change. James took her hand then, interlacing their fingers like he had that night in his study. I've been thinking about what you said, about people like me not really changing. And you're right, in a way. I'll always be someone who grew up with privilege. But I can choose what to do with that privilege. What do you mean? James smiled, and Grace could see the wheels turning behind his eyes. I mean, maybe it's time to remember why I wanted to build a technology company in the first place. To connect people. To solve problems that matter. He squeezed her hand. I'm thinking about starting over. Something smaller, more focused. Maybe something that helps people like you, working people trying to build better lives. Grace felt her heart skip. James, you don't have to. I want to. Not for you, but because of you. Because you've shown me what it looks like to live with purpose. James lifted their joined hands and pressed a kiss to her knuckles. I want to build something we can both be proud of. Something that matters. They sat in comfortable silence for a moment, watching the leaves fall around them. The reporters were still there, still documenting this strange love story between a billionaire and a waitress, but Grace found she didn't care anymore. Let them watch. Let them judge. She'd spent too many years hiding from the possibility of love because of what other people might think. I have one condition, Grace said finally. Anything. I'm still going to nursing school. I'm still going to work, at least part-time. I need to have my own life, my own purpose. I won't be another project for you to manage or improve. James nodded seriously. I wouldn't want you to be. The woman I fell in love with is independent and strong and determined to build her own future. I want to support that, not change it. And I won't sign any prenups with morality clauses, Grace added, only half joking. James laughed, a real laugh that made Grace's heart sing. Grace Martinez, I would marry you tomorrow with nothing but the clothes on my back and a handshake for a contract. The word marry hung in the air between them, loaded with possibilities that made Grace's breath catch. It was too soon, too fast, too crazy to even think about. But as she looked at James, this man who had given up an empire for the chance to love her, it didn't feel crazy at all. Ask me again in a year, Grace said softly. When we've had time to figure out what this looks like in the real world. I will, James promised. Every day for a year, if that's what it takes. Grace leaned into him then, letting him wrap his arms around her as they sat beneath the oak tree where she dreamed of different futures. This wasn't the future she'd imagined. It was bigger and scarier and more wonderful than anything she'd dared to hope for. So what now? Grace asked, her head on his shoulder. Now we go back to your world and tell Mrs. Chun that you're taking the rest of the day off, James said. Then we go back to my world, our world, and start figuring out how to build a life together. The reporters are going to follow us everywhere for weeks. Probably. But they'll get bored eventually. Rich man falls in love with working woman isn't really that interesting a story in the long run. Grace pulled back to look at him. Isn't it? No, James said, his eyes warm with something that looked like forever. What's interesting is what comes after. What we build together. How we choose to love each other every single day. He stood up and offered her his hand. Come on, Grace Martinez. Let's go home. Grace took his hand and let him pull her to her feet. Around them, cameras flashed and reporters called out questions, but she only had eyes for James. This man who had learned to choose love over safety, vulnerability over control, connection over isolation. As they walked back toward the diner hand in hand, Grace thought about the night of the thunderstorm when James had opened the door to his terrace and shown her the beauty he'd never noticed before. Now she was opening doors for him, to her world, to a different kind of life, to the possibility that love could be stronger than the forces trying to tear them apart. "James," Grace said as they reached the diner. "Yeah. Thank you." "For what?" Grace smiled, remembering the way he'd asked her the same question at the accident scene, when thank you had seemed inadequate for pulling someone from wreckage. "For fighting," she said. "For choosing me. For proving that some people really can change." James stopped walking and turned to face her fully, right there on the sidewalk with the world watching. He cupped her face in his hands the way he had during the storm, his thumbs brushing across her cheekbones. "Thank you," he said, "for saving my life. Both times." And then he kissed her, soft and sure and full of promise, while cameras clicked and reporters shouted questions, and the people who loved them best watched from the diner windows with tears in their eyes. When they finally broke apart, Grace was crying and laughing at the same time. "This is insane," she said. "Completely," James agreed. "Want to be insane together?" Grace looked at him. This man who had given up everything for love, who was willing to start over with nothing but hope and determination, and felt her heart make its final choice. "Yes," she said. "Let's be insane together." They walked into Murphy's diner hand in hand, ready to face whatever came next. Behind them, the city continued its daily rhythm of work and dreams and small acts of kindness. Ahead of them stretched a future that was uncertain but full of possibility. And in the space between them, love bloomed like a flower that had somehow learned to grow in the wreckage of what they'd both thought their lives had to be. 6 months later, Grace would graduate from nursing school with honors, while James launched a nonprofit technology company focused on connecting underserved communities with educational resources. Mrs. Chun would cry at their small wedding in the diner where they'd found their way back to each other. And every morning, James would wake up grateful for the car crash that had ended one life and begun another. But all of that was still to come. For now, there was just this. 2 people who had learned that love was worth fighting for, especially when the odds were stacked against them. Love often asks us to risk everything for the chance of something beautiful. What would you be willing to risk for true connection?